is the first episode of season 8 of Conversing Labs. I'm your host, Paul Roberts, and as you know, here on Conversing Labs, we bring in and talk to the best minds in cybersecurity, threat intelligence, software supply chain security, malware analysis, you name it. And very, very happy to have with us today in the studio my colleague here at Reversing Labs, Jason Valenti. Jason, welcome.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for having me on. That's that's a pretty nice intro. A lot of pressure there. Season 8, episode 1. We'll see what we could do here today.
I think you live up to it. Right. I think you live up to it. So, Jason, you're the Director of Product Management here for and focus on threat intelligence. Obviously, Reversing Labs has a deep and long history with threat intelligence, as do you in your personal career. So we're going to talk today really about this threat intel space, how it's evolved, what role it's played in your own professional life, and kind of what direction we're going in. It's going to be an interesting talk, and I hope everybody out there on X and YouTube and LinkedIn enjoy the conversation, because I think it's a very relevant one. So, Jason, for folks who aren't familiar with you or haven't come across you in their professional lives, could you maybe just tell us a little bit about kind of your journey into cyber and also, the threat intelligence space specifically?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the kind intro. We'll try to do our best here to keep folks entertained. But no, I appreciate the kind words. As you mentioned too, I'm here at Reversing Labs as a director of product management, and I work alongside our engineering team and with a talented group of product managers, and we're looking after malware analysis, threat intel, threat hunting products that fit within a portfolio over here at Reversing Labs, which is sort of our sister portfolio to our software supply chain security products. So yeah, the journey into threat intel for me wasn't necessarily a straight line. And I think that's one thing that a lot of folks who are wanting to get into cybersecurity or threat intelligence should understand about it. It's there's not necessarily a specific straight path for getting into these type of things. So for me, I was, always a really curious sort of engineering type of person. I always wanted to try to understand how things worked, and that led me to going to college for computer information systems. And then, at that time too, I was always very interested in like the internet and the different types of subcultures that were on the internet. And I was on the internet pretty early on, when I could still remember the days of, these sort of script kiddie groups and just different types of folks that would hang around and try to cause mischief online. So for one reason or another, I was just always interested in that. I thought it was interesting. And, one thing led to another. Like I said, I came out of college and began working as a software engineer. And, that's a fantastic way to kind of get into this space, because you learn about technology and you learn about the different types of systems that are behind the scenes and that power applications like we're using today to do this very show. And I feel like once you have that sort of understanding, and then you look at how sort of criminal organizations look to try to exploit these applications, you become to really understand and like get a good sense of how they're doing these type of things, from an engineering point of view. So, that's sort of the journey how I led into this stuff. And when you start to look at aspects of cybersecurity, it really just boils down to there's underlying technology behind it. If you have an understanding of how it works, you're typically understanding like, okay, well, it breaks a lot. As technology never really works. So you start to notice stuff about it. You start to notice, the ways the technology is put together. Oftentimes, it's not really put together with the security first mindset.
We're going to talk about that. Yeah.
Right. So, so on and so forth. Being sort of an entrepreneurial person, it kind of led me, in and out of some public service that I did. I had some time spent, at the Department of Justice within the FBI, working in technology, which we could talk about as well. But, it was kind of it wasn't a straight path, and you kind of get introduced to some of this stuff. And, depending on your curiosity levels, if it piques your interest, you can kind of press on those buttons and head in those directions, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly of a certain generation, right? I mean, there was no effective cybersecurity industry before, I don't know, maybe the mid to late 1990s. So yeah, you were almost by definition finding your way to it through, other means, or other paths, whether that's military or whether it's, work, hanging out at the Loft in Boston or what have you. So you mentioned that you work for the FBI, which very interesting part of your career. Talk to us a little bit about what you did there, and obviously what you learned working within that organization, which is kind of the point of the spear for a lot of cyber criminal investigations that happen here in in the U.S. anyway.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. That was a privilege. It was a privilege to be able to work alongside folks whose roles and responsibilities it is to protect, the United States interests both here and abroad. And being a part of that organization, it's very humbling. You're working alongside of folks who are very high IQ, very dedicated to the mission, and everyone is really working from a public service perspective. You're working on behalf of the United States. You're working on behalf of the United States citizens and our interest as a country.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of responsibility there. So in particular, I was part of a technical organization who worked alongside of special agents within that organization. And, throughout the investigative process, there's a lot of challenges that investigators face, and oftentimes those challenges, lead them down the road to needing to figure out things from a technical perspective, so solving crime is sort of a team sport, right? You're doing it alongside of, folks that are technical in nature who could write code and reverse engineer stuff. And then part of those teams, you're working with intelligence analysts, so folks who are
different skill set, right?
Yeah, different skill set. They're connecting the dots, right? We're connecting the dots. And then you have sort of the law enforcement aspect of it, the folks who are kicking doors down and serving warrants and going after these criminal organizations who would wish to do harm to not only U.S. citizens, both here and abroad, but also any organization, So for me, that's sort of how I get introduced to the core concepts of what really drives the whole cybersecurity industry and market, which is, a public and private sector response to try to disrupt criminal organizations who want to try to steal things and disrupt operations, or, maybe it could be something light, like just, performing hacktivism to get a certain message out there on behalf of their group, or maybe a hostile foreign government. So, it's really that time in the Bureau gave me a good sense of the behind the scenes of how all this stuff works and how the money flows. And that behind the scenes, it's typically, either hostile foreign governments and just very motivated criminal organizations. And they both have very specific motivations, behind what it is their objectives are. So, yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, when you think about it, organizations like the FBI, law enforcement in general, not only in this country, but pretty much every other country, like cyber crime really only emerged as a thing within about the last 20, 25 years, right? I mean, there was, not that there weren't, viruses and other stuff, but it was more kind of stunts and, kind of folks trying to boost their reputation, I love you virus. It wasn't about stealing information. It was just about getting, cred. And then, I mean, even when I started covering cybersecurity, like there wasn't really a lot about cyber crime. And now it's, depending on the estimate, right? I mean, $1 trillion industry, basically, or certainly, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Right.
Yeah. And I would imagine, this is something that the FBI kind of had to come to grips with, sort of like, oh, holy cow, like, this is a whole other new type of crime that's happening, and we need to kind of level 100%. Up to be able to fight it. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. And it became a problem that like seemingly happened overnight.
Yeah. In the big scheme of things. Yeah.
Right. For the longest time, criminal organizations were monetizing towards stuff that everyone sort of knows about. Yep. All different ways to be able to make money, and that's typically where criminals lie. That's their main objective, it's to make revenue. So not unlike a company, so
drugs, prostitution, gambling, right?
Right. Yeah. So you had law enforcement agencies and for the most part, the entire intelligence community sort of oriented around that model. And then the business model changed. It became easier to move online. It became easier to get into the business of, extorting money and stealing money digitally than it would be to knock a door down and go into a bank and steal that money out of there, or control big areas of the drug traffic and drug trade. So, to a certain extent, the criminal organizations who recognize that, they were leaders of that space. It sounds odd to look at it like that, but they realized, hey, here's an area where we could make a lot of money for not a lot of effort, and no one's really watching. So organizations, like,
and we're not putting our bodies at risk. We're sitting here behind a computer. Nobody's going to get shot or blown up or anything. Yeah, right.
100%. So there was a big sort of retooling, and resourcing up of not only like members of the intel community, but broader law enforcement in general, both at the federal, state, and local level, which is still, one of those things you hear about today. Those organizations are always trying to stay ahead or 2 steps ahead of adversaries, and it's very complicated. It's very challenging to do that.
So with that in mind, like when we're talking about threat intelligence, which is kind of the bread and butter of what law enforcement agencies are trafficking in and monitoring, what are you, there are different definitions of it. What's kind of the definition that sits with you, and how people should understand what we're talking about when we use the phrase threat intelligence?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think if you ask 20 people their definition of threat intel, you get 20 different definitions, right? It's one of those things that, oftentimes just seems, very mysterious. But, I think when I think about threat intelligence, I feel like the overall definition of it had to evolve since how it first started, right? Like we're talking crime, talking criminal organizations. In the past, they weren't really that complex. Organizationally, they could be pretty big and sprawling, but for the most part, it was just really like a layer of human capital. And then over time, right, as crime started to evolve from these things like we know of bank robberies and drug trade and drug trafficking, those things really into like the digital space, the complexities of the criminal organizations and the tools and methods in which they employ to carry out whatever it is their objective is became really complex. So suddenly you had this picture, right, that was like a tree with thousands of vines and branches, right? So you really needed a way to be able to start looking at that and connecting those dots and figuring out like, how does all this make sense, right? So I think it was one of these things that kind of grew out of necessity over time, and within the intelligence community, of course, the intelligence analyst plays a critical role in being able to connect those dots. And naturally, as crime started to sort of progress digitally and move more into like cyber facing crimes, those folks sort of started focusing on that that aspect, connecting dots, trying to understand who these criminal organizations were, taking inventory of, the different tactics, techniques, the approaches that they took, the tools they're using to be able to carry out their exploits. And that in of itself is an extremely complicated job, trying to keep track and tabs on all of that. So I feel like it kind of gave birth to this industry that's sort of well defined today, the threat intel market. But I think in its simplest of terms, the way I like to explain it to folks is just like, it's additional information that could help you understand the who, what, when, where, and why behind a crime, behind an incident. And today, unlike 20 years ago, an incident, involving a computer or an endpoint or some cloud location is a lot more complex, right? You just can't look right at it and understand what's happening. And so teams in particular today are responsible for, having to explain so much more about an incident and how that relates to their vast infrastructure that, they need to protect, as security operation folks, working in conjunction with, we hope a lot of the times, a cyber threat intel team, but that's often not the case.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Part of your journey, before you came to ReversingLabs, you were at CrowdStrike. Obviously, they were a pretty, important, transformative company in the, malware detection and prevention space, endpoint detection and response,
Right.
but also really leveraged threat intelligence very heavily as part of, the types of protections that they were offering, moving from this kind of, signature matching basically of, the first generation antivirus to something much more kind of holistic, including,
Right.
Leveraging threat intel. So what, talk to us a little bit about your experience there and, how you saw CrowdStrike kind of leveraging threat intelligence to provide, like better, just endpoint protection and how that fit into their overall system.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It was a fantastic experience. I started there very early on. It was still a very small company when I joined there, and the energy for this brand new market that they created, this endpoint detection and response market, they essentially coined and created, was fascinating to see. And I think with that approach, it was just so game changing and transformative on the endpoint. It produced so much high fidelity information about what's going on at the endpoint layer within an organization, and the telemetry that's sort of presented from an endpoint detection and response perspective compared to the standards of the time, which were just like you mentioned, the signature based traditional AVs. There wasn't a lot going on there. There's scanning happening. It tells you something's bad and you kind of move down with your day. The EDRs sort of introduced, it's a whole new playing field with so much more telemetry and data on there. I feel like the way CrowdStrike really leveraged the threat intelligence that was produced and still to this day is produced by Adam Myers and the CrowdStrike intelligence team, which does a fantastic job of keeping track of, some of the most prolific nation state actors that are operating out there today, following these organizations, understanding, their tactics, techniques, their tools, their approach. CrowdStrike really humanized these incidents that security professionals are dealing with. And what I mean by humanize is they really help folks understand. They were the first company to really help
cartoonized them as well.
Right. Right. To really help people understand that, hey, it's just not some, hacking computer code, some bug that's going on your endpoint, right? That just needs to be blown away and wiped away. it's actually in certain cases a criminal organization, and those are real people, or it's a hostile foreign government. So once security folks were sort of presented with a framework to think about incidents, it was just sort of like I feel like it was a game changing moment. And, I feel really honored to have been a part of that and have worked there and saw sort of the impact it made for the company, but also the industry, because it really set the precedence where it's like, okay, let's start talking about these incidents for what they really are. These are criminal organizations and hostile foreign governments looking to, steal secrets, steal trade secrets, steal money, disrupt organizations. So let's just call it out how it is. Let's track them the best way we can and produce information on those organizations so teams that are responsible for defending are up to speed, and they know who they're dealing with. Like, as folks who are working in cybersecurity, you're defending. You're always on defense. You never really have a chance to play offense, so you get worn down. So you need to know who you're playing against in this game. And I
It's
feel
not
like
even clear you can play offense, right? I mean, there are all
right.
kinds of legal ramifications around
That's
that.
right.
So yeah,
That's right. I mean, they're constantly defending the goal.
Yeah.
They never had have a chance to take their own swing. So it's. I feel like as an industry, companies that are working within the threat intel space, and it's kind of one of the reasons why you see a lot of companies being able to exist within the threat intelligence market at the same time, is because they all bring something really special to the table. And CrowdStrike really brought something very, very special to the table in terms of adversarial threat intel, as well as other aspects of threat intelligence. But the adversarial threat intel was really game changing.
Putting names and characters around these various nation state groups, the panda groups and absolutely the bears, obviously. What when we talk about threat, I mean, so when I think about threat intelligence, it's such a broad term. But I mean, the types of things I think about are, sort of what type of malware a particular group might use, what their command and control infrastructure looks like, like what types of, organizations they target and for what type of information, and what if companies aren't already consuming and using threat intelligence, like what types of stuff is in a threat intelligence feed that you may buy, or a product that's leveraging threat intelligence, and like how do you leverage that? How do you use it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so we get that question a lot. I feel like that's top of mind for a lot of organizations. Once you get to a certain maturity level as a company within your security organization, you begin to start thinking about things from, a more detailed reactionary standpoint as well as a proactive standpoint. So from a threat intel perspective, operationalizing various aspects of it really comes down to, the company itself, what the company's actual objective is, and the maturity of those security teams. Like for example, if you're an organization like at ReversingLabs here, a lot of folks know us from, our file threat intelligence. And rightfully so. We're at its core, we're ingesting, massive volumes of files, different security objects on a daily basis. Right? We're breaking those down, through a lot of different processes in which we use. A lot of them are proprietary for us. And, we're analyzing those files and we're extracting information out of those files and in reanalyzing those artifacts that are coming out of those objects to essentially produce like what's talked about out there in the threat intel space from a feeds perspective are indicators of compromise. Right. And the way I like to kind of explain those, it's essentially just digital evidence. that ReversingLabs has seen associated with something either malicious or good. In our case, we actually have threat intelligence on things that are considered goodware, which is fairly unique to what we do here. But essentially, that's how I like to explain it. It's digital evidence that a company has observed, based on something that either malicious or maybe suspicious or maybe completely clean. And typically with indicators of compromise, they could be hashes, IPs, URLs, domains. And it's basically, we're saying, hey, like to an organization, here's a bunch of digital evidence that we have that is associated with crime, that is associated with stuff that we could attribute to crime, right? Malware, whatever it is, incidents that happen involving these things. So, oftentimes that's really useful for security teams because they could take that in and then compare it to what they're seeing internally, compare it to telemetry that's coming out of some internal tools, compare it to EDR data, compare it to what they're seeing at the edge, some of their network-based devices, and just sort of compare and contrast. And then oftentimes organizations, depending on their maturity level, they could power automated security workflows with that data, and still to this day, you hear security teams with blocking use cases. They take a lot of the high fidelity stuff and they dump it into their edge and network devices to just sort of not allow any communication with devices that are talking on those channels. So, there's a lot of different ways it can be applied, from an indicator of compromise. And then, of course, like within the threat intel space, like we were discussing, there's adversarial threat intelligence, which is everything you'd ever want to know about these criminal organizations, where they're at, how they operate, what their organizational structures look like, what kind of tooling they use, what type of malware they write, what their motivations are. So it's like, there's a lot of different aspects of it. Then you have finished intelligence, of course, which are very rich, very detailed research reports, and operationalizing that stuff really all comes back to an organization's maturity level. Certain time, oftentimes in this industry, in this macroeconomic climate too, everyone's looking to cut back and then, downsize certain aspects of their approaches and their security organizations. But, there's a big need for it within organizations that sort of have that, demand for it from a maturization standpoint. So
my sense is a lot of companies, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I sort of love the idea of threat intelligence, but get hung up on, well, I mean, do we really have anyone on staff who can leverage this? Like, we don't have, former FBI people working for us. We got IT people, we got a couple people who kind of have security background, but, not high level, incident response people. And so why should we pay for it if we can't really leverage it? Especially since, does this increase our liability? If we have this threat intel, are we then liable if something happens and, we knew about it because it was in this threat feed we got? Are those kind of pushback that you hear? And I guess, obviously, the question is, what's the answer to that for those non-Fortune 100 firms that have the resources and staffing to dive deep into a threat intel feed?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you look across the board, certain organizations have particular regulations, that are very stringent, right? And they require, a certain set of checks and balances need to be done internally. Like if you're in the financial vertical or government vertical or pharmaceutical vertical, you're obviously, these are large organizations. They're heavily regulated organizations. They're very global, right? So it's very important for these organizations to be able to take offensive measures, as well as trying to be as proactive as they possibly can be to try to understand, who it is that's targeting them. It's very important because the stakes are very high. They have a lot to lose. Oftentimes these are organizations that are managing people's retirement funds. They're powering the financial infrastructure here in the United States as well as other places around the globe,
or the physical infrastructure.
Yeah, so
water.
the stakes are very, very high there. So these teams, typically, they're well organized, they're staffed really well, and they have budgets to be able to entertain and operationalize threat intel. But like you're mentioning too, I think the further you go down market, when it comes to smaller organizations, if they're asking the question, what is this stuff and how do we think we might be able to implement it, they're just not ready yet. And oftentimes you see sometimes it's too late where these organizations will become, they'll become hit.
Yeah.
So, and after the smoke clears, after they've been ransomed or something, some sort of incident happens, like all of a sudden security now needs to become paramount,
right,
top of mind, where we're in the industry and we like to believe that the biggest budgets within an organization is security, but it's just not.
No,
it's just not. In organizations,
marketing. I mean, like, what are most companies spending most of their budget on?
Well, it depends. In the financial world, like in the banking world, like they're focused on doing what it is that they do best.
Right.
Or protecting money or making money on that money, and security and IT and technology is a thing they had to adopt. It's not their core business.
Right.
So
by and large, they do a very good job on security, certainly compared to other industries as well, because it's actually existential for them as organizations, right? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and that's sort of where the ISACs come in too. And I'm interested in your thoughts on, how, because there are obviously so many different, financial services or healthcare or manufacturing, generally dominated by larger companies with more resources. But then there are like dentist's office, right? Got a ton of sensitive data, but they're never going to be billion-dollar organizations. These are all kind of small organizations. And that's sort of where, or we saw recently, agriculture, right? So, okay, I operate grain silos, it's good business for me, but I don't have a huge IT staff, nor will I ever. And that's sort of where the ISACs come in as these industry-based, let's work collectively to try and manage some of this information and get people informed about what's going on. What are your thoughts on whether that model, obviously it works really well in like financial services and other sectors, but my sense is it varies a lot from one ISAC to another, how active they are, how effective they are, and the quality of information they're distributing.
I think, like you were saying too, there are a bunch of ISACs that I feel like they bring a lot of value to the organizations that participate in them, and just the concept of being open and being able to share information between what would seemingly be seen as competitors in a certain vertical makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're all in that space, you're all trying to do what's unique to you, but ultimately you're all faced with the same threat. And I think everyone could rally around trying to, thwart that threat as much as they possibly can. I think you highlight something that the industry just hasn't figured out yet. As you get outside of, the Fortune 100, 250 or 500, the further down you go, like you're mentioning too, small to medium-sized businesses are the majority. And, there just hasn't been this sort of attention or adoption within those organizations. And, there are some efforts, I feel like, there's certain nonprofits like the Center for Internet Security, in conjunction with Department of Homeland Security and CISA. They have some really good efforts going on there to try to partner with state and local governments, from an education standpoint, to really help, small to medium-sized businesses within their states, within their districts, sort of get a little proactive and just kind of even understand how important it is to have some sense around cyber hygiene.
Yeah.
Because typically you'll have a small business and the last thing they're thinking about is any sort of security. They're just looking to get their point of sale machines stood up, or some sort of inventory computer, or computers that they need to use, or like a network of dentists or doctors, who aren't part of like large healthcare systems. They're not typically thinking about how to defend against, criminal organizations who want to steal sensitive patient information,
Right.
or even financial information.
Right.
It's very detrimental to the individuals who are involved with those type of things. So I don't think we've figured it out yet as an industry. I still feel like, a lot more could be done at that level. And it looks like there are some, not-for-profits and nonprofit organizations kind of, pressing on some of those buttons, but it's a greenfield space. I just don't see a lot of attention right now in that space.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that folks have probably read about recently are these typhoon hacks, these Chinese APT groups. And when I read about these, I'm sort of like, okay, these are, sophisticated nation state campaigns targeting, high value targets. And I'm interested in your thoughts. I don't know that their modus operandi, their MO is all that different from rank and file cyber criminal groups, ransomware groups, in terms of how they're getting access to their targets. Their motivations may be different, but how these attacks play out isn't really that different. And a lot of it increasingly seems focused on, getting access, figuring out what hardware, software you're using, what your supply chain looks like, and then targeting that. The Cell Typhoon hacks, they're going after vulnerable Cisco routers, or they've done their research on LinkedIn. They saw one of your employees, advertising this skill set with this platform. They're going to go after that platform if what they want is to get you. So it sort of seems like, are we a target? Any organization? It's like, absolutely, because it's not just about you. It's also about who your customers are, right? Who your users are, and yeah. But yeah. I also sort of, if Cell Typhoon wants to hack us, what can I really do about it practically? And I think that's kind of where you come in, and companies like ReversingLabs, is there actually is stuff that you can do about it. So what do you advise companies when you talk to them about, how to, start down the road of being able to, push back, turn down those attacks by sophisticated actors?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure there's one sort of prescription for any of it. I think when you think about like the type of criminal organizations that are behind things like Salt Typhoon and the approach they take, it's obviously multi-layered. You have the front end component of it, which identifies as ransomware, or some sort of backdoor attempt at data exfiltration, or just laying in wait, reconnaissance, those type of things. But from a nation state perspective, that is of course also highly coupled with an insider threat perspective as well. So it's not only like there's not only one alley that they're walking down to try to attack, but it's a multi-pronged sort of approach at attacking. And I feel like oftentimes the smaller to mid-sized business, or and even consumer, Oftentimes it's kind of looked at as like, well, that group of individuals just doesn't matter. They're not companies, they don't need modern approaches. But I mean, if you think about it too, if you think about the primary motivations a lot of the times of hostile foreign governments, it's to be able to disrupt and it's to be able to interrupt. So you can imagine in a scenario in which some incident happened, right? Like, having access to and the ability to interrupt and disrupt like large swaths of the American public's communication devices, phones, their computers, they're now rendered with the inability to get information, to get news. Their TVs don't work, their mobile phones don't work, they have no internet connections, their devices are locked up. So it's very easy at that point to have misinformation spreading and, slowing down of what's actually really happening. And I think, hostile foreign governments, they want that advantage, and it's something that we can't let up on. So I feel like it's kind of related to that problem we were talking about before that's kind of unsolved. You have a whole entire layer of, folks that are here within the continental US that are oftentimes running poorly secured, very, very outdated technology, both within these small to medium-sized businesses that they work in and or operate. And then when they leave, their own personal devices. So I feel like I look at that as really more of an awareness and education problem. So I feel like that's an area in cybersecurity that has obviously grown, but it's an area that needs to be continually prioritized and emphasized, at the state and local level, to just keep folks informed. Because those folks own businesses and, they manage businesses, and those businesses are small and medium-sized businesses. So the more informed people could be about, these organizations, these criminal organizations that would wish to do harm and disrupt, the better off we'll be, because they'll bring that knowledge into the organizations that they work at or they run, and hopefully we can start to see better results.
Yeah, I mean, it was really clear as a sort of old model of just like, well, secure your network perimeter and keep the bad guys out is totally gone. And now it's much more, you need to understand what types of groups are targeting your specific type of organization and what their methods are and what they, how they're likely to get in and what they're likely to do if they do get in. By understanding all that, you can protect yourself. But you're never just going to keep everybody out, which was kind of the old model. And in fact, we should note there's a new Netflix series out called 0 Day that is a thriller, kind of political thriller with like Robert De Niro, I think, that basically is premised on this whole idea of a just disruptive cyber attack. And
that's right. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing too today, it's like, compared to 20 years ago or 25 years ago, you had a lot of different access points for the internet, a lot of different devices. Today, the whole world is basically either on two platforms, Android or Apple. Do you know what I mean? Like, and everyone is using a browser to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
So the attack surface from that,
and probably one of like 2 or 3 browsers.
That's right. That's right. So it's, these criminal organizations and hostile foreign governments need to worry about a lot less today.
Yes.
So the emphasis of being able to infiltrate at the human level from an insider perspective, as well as, a technology perspective, they have a more narrowed playing field now.
Yep. So okay. Do you have time for like 2 more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the first one is obviously, it's hard to talk about technology these days and not mention or talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning. They're becoming a huge part of software development processes, but also AI-driven applications are really just washing into enterprises at huge levels, and all kinds of capabilities there, both on the threat protection side, but also on the malicious actor side. What are your thoughts on just kind of how AI is going to change the threat intelligence game, as it were? Is it going to empower the defenders, the threat intelligence companies, or is it going to make it easier to escape notice, I guess?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we've been seeing with this Gen AI, and the different types of transformative ways in which people are using it. I mean, it's certainly game changing from a lot of different perspectives. From a threat intel perspective and a malware analysis perspective, I feel like these are such transformative tools that these folks could now add into their tool belt.
Yeah.
To help abstract away a lot of the manual labor work that's associated with connecting dots and trying to summarize and understand vast amounts of information. It's always very complicated to be able to do that, without getting fatigued, without having to context switch 5,000 times. If you now have a tool, and like I like to use a lot of analogies with this, it's basically the difference of, cutting wood with a handsaw versus using a power saw.
Mm-hmm.
You'll take the power saw all day. It's not necessarily going to replace the carpenter. It's just going to make that carpenter a lot more efficient, a lot more effective, and allow them to stay on task, on brand, with less context switching, and be very much more effective. But these tools also give that capability to criminals, right? So, they
know
they're
going to use them.
Right. And I feel like there's still a lot of unsolved problems within, the Gen AI space in terms of interpretability and, security in general on how these LLMs work. But, I feel like there are a lot of frontier model companies that are doing a lot in terms of safety and security and trying to ensure that folks aren't using those technologies from a malicious standpoint. But as you see, every day the news is changing. Now you could download a very capable LLM, open source, as we saw with stuff like DeepSeek, or Llama. You could download these things and sort of make your own custom versions of these and tune them and train them. So it's going to be interesting to see how how all this stuff plays out.
Absolutely. And I mean, among the things we've noted is, attackers are hip to that as well.
Right.
And just like they've been targeting, open source ecosystems, try and worm their way into legitimate applications or development organizations. Yeah, same is true with AI and ML, right? Like they're targeting that development infrastructure too. Okay, final question is the natural last question, which is, so folks want to learn if they're, heard what you said, curious about, maybe we should be looking to leverage threat intel more as part of what we're doing here in my organization. Where would you recommend they go to find out more, learn more, and get started?
Yeah, sure. Just drop a comment. My DMs are always open on socials. I'm on LinkedIn. If you're seeing this on there, leave a comment. The DMs are open, and we'll go from there. And from a product standpoint, no pressure there. You want to have a conversation. Yeah. And kind of understand stuff, sure. I'm not going to try to come in and try to sell you.
No sales, just
right. No sales. Leave a comment or just drop a note in DMs. I'd be happy to connect.
Cool. Hey, Jason, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us on ConversingLabs. It's been great and really insightful. Thanks for your help, kind of explaining this pretty complex topic to our listeners. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Paul. I had a great time joining, and I'll be sure to note that Netflix show with Robert De Niro. I'll add it to my
Zero Day, man. Absolutely.
We'll see what happens.
One of the top watched films on Netflix, according to my feed. Yeah. So I've heard mixed things about it. As we know, Hollywood doesn't always kind of get the details on cyber stuff right.
Right.
But
Exactly.
I don't know. I haven't watched it, so I can't really say.
Well,
If you have watched it, put your comments in. I'd be interested to know what you thought.
Right.
All right, man. Hey, thank you so much. We'll do this again, Jason.
Thank you. See you, everyone.
All right.
Thanks.
Yep. Bye.